Okay, everybody's got it.
We're here. Well, hello, everyone. I would, on the behalf of the Humanities Center, I would like to welcome everyone to this virtual book launch. I'm Jamie Goodrich, the director of the center, and today we are gathered to celebrate the publication of Fred Vultee's A Media Framing Approach to Securitization, Storytelling in Conflict, Crises, and Threat. And I'm going to hand over the baton to John Anderson, who I think will take things away. And he's been the coordinator of these book launches, and we've relied on his expertise and wisdom in this. And so I'm so grateful to him. I just want to thank him for this before I hand over the baton to him. So John, to you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I really appreciate that. I do just want to say, as chair of the Humanities Center Book Launch Committee, I also just want to welcome everybody today. We are thrilled to have you all here to celebrate this virtual launch. And I really would just like to kind of take the opportunity just to welcome and introduce Dr. Catherine McGuire, professor and chair in the Department of Communication here at Wayne State University, who will go ahead and introduce proper our author, Dr. Fred Vultee, and our moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Stoichev. So Dr. McGuire.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I bring greetings from New Orleans, Louisiana today, and welcome you to the book launch. So as you heard, my name is Catherine McGuire, professor and chair in the Department of Communication here at Wayne State, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's author and my very dear friend, Dr. Fred Vultee. Dr. Vultee is an associate professor of journalism in the department here at Wayne State. Dr. Vultee came to Wayne State in 2007 after completing his MA and PhD from the University of Missouri. And he came to the University of Missouri after more than a 20-year career as a newspaper editor in outlets from around the country. Dr. Vultee is a committed educator, award-winning mentor, and internationally renowned scholar whose research examines how media framing influences political decision-making and public attitudes towards security, with a focus on the role that journalistic practices and practitioners, particularly the news editors, play in that process. Dr. Vultee is an author, co-author, editor of 3 books, as well as 33 articles and book chapters, with some of the best titles in publishing today, such as Spike the Football, Truth-Telling, the Press, and the Bin Laden Photos, Jump Back Jack, Mohammed's Here, Fox News and the Construction of Islamic Peril, and my personal favorite, Potato Chip, Botulism and Carbon Monoxide, the Lying, Bullshitting Distinction in Fake News. Now, Dr. Witt, he is Dr. Witt, actually. Dr. Vultee's sharp wit, keen insight, deep knowledge of history, and professional background as a writer and editor are all evident in today's book, which is worth repeating again: A Media Framing Approach to Securitization, Storytelling in Conflict, Crisis, and Threat. So to help guide today's conversation, I'm also happy to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Stoichev, who is also an associate professor of journalism in our department, as well as an award-winning educator and internationally known scholar of political communication, whose own research focuses on the role of emerging media in democratization and how the online mass surveillance of emerging media threatens to undermine its democratic promise. I am so very proud to work with these 2 amazing scholars who do such important and impactful work. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Drs. Vultee and Stoichev.
Thank you, Kat. I also am very excited to be here. I'm just flattered to be moderating today's discussion and getting to talk more with Fred about his new book, Securitization, Media Framing in general, and hear more of these famous Fredisms. So I want to kick us off by having Fred describe his inspiration for the book. So what led you to connect communication and use that as a lens to study securitization?
Okay, well, for all you graduate students out there, this is a good moment to take note. I was literally reading for my qualifying exams. Didn't really have a topic for them yet, and I ran across a wonderful quote kind of in the founding securitization text that I think I've got that on my other screen here, that went, "Who can do or speak security successfully on what issues, under what conditions, and with which effects?" And my mind immediately flashed back to those first seminars and Harold Laswell, Who Says What to Whom? And it occurred to me, this is a wonderful theory in international relations. It is kind of in that constructivist camp that acknowledges that a threat can be real, kind of like a hurricane can be real and have real physical aspects and be a social construct at the same time. That nobody had looked at this as a media phenomenon yet. And so I thought, well, that's something interesting. I wonder if we took what we know about framing, dating back to Harold Laswell, and put it together and said, let's explore this idea. Let's explore this construction of existential threat to society, extraordinary measures to protect society, and that kind of permanent license to, we'll just hide under the bed until you tell us it's safe to come out. And looked at that as a media construct. It's middle of the war on terrorism, kind of that high tide of 2006. Made sense to look at it that way.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. And as I'm sure all of the graduate students in the room and even us more experienced faculty, not all ideas are well received at the beginning. I know that Max McCombs famously has come out and said that his original idea about agenda setting was initially rejected from our flagship conference. How was your idea received when you proposed this to your advisor and your committee?
Well, I think we had a Max McCombs anecdote in the theory class last night. So I was trying to remember whether it was he or Shaw who held the manuscript over the trash basket for the other one to say, well, let's give it one more try. Actually, aside from one eye roll, it went pretty well. People kind of liked the idea. I think that's one thing about framing theory is when we're not yelling and screaming about whether we are a fractured paradigm or whether it's perfectly okay to be a fractured paradigm, that we tend to be open to new ideas and to new ideas. Let's kind of take this, I kind of think of it as our communication flashlight, see if we can lend it to a few other disciplines and help illuminate things that they might not have thought of in our particular way before. So that I got some very nice reactions from the international relations community. Scott Watson from Canada asked me if I wanted to be on a panel after he stumbled across the dissertation. Much to my delight, the founding fathers of securitization were running to about 15 different panels that day, but managed to check in and not throw things. So in general, I thought it was a really kind reception from the sociological branch, the folks whose interest is in looking at conditions beyond maybe the specific philosophical Speech Act questions that go into making up these security claims and into how people accept them.
Yeah. And I think I'm excited to see how this book is received. I'm sure that it will similarly receive positive feedback all around. I'm very, very excited to get to share more of it. But before we get too far, I see a lot of communication faces in the room. Can you tell us what it means to securitize an issue and what the media's role is in that process?
Okay, sure. Great idea. Lest we ever forget to start at the beginning sometimes when we're introducing these things. Broadly, as it was conceptualized, and this is coming out of some work that constructivist scholars had done with looking at security sectors and their development after the Cold War, was the idea that in addition to the physical threats we see to security, that we can also, incorporating with them, create this idea that security is something that calls an existential threat. We will no longer be able to do something about this threat if we don't fix it now. To a referent object, something that we all mutually cherish. That can be our border, banking system of government, our way of life, one of the other important things to look at it. And then gaining enough assent from whatever audience, and that can be an audience ranging from the popular vote in a parliamentary system, the vote in a mixed democratic system like ours, the Politburo in an autocracy, wherever you need to get that assent to move ahead with it, to invoke these extraordinary measures for the duration until the power that you've claimed to yourself is now solved. So initially it was looked at, in international relations primarily for issues like immigration. And when we look back we look today back at the 90s, we can see some of those same constructs. What is immigration? Is immigration the sort of thing that we handle through standard existing procedures? Or does it mean a change to our way of life? When we hear a Marine Le Pen saying, give us back France, damn it. Are we hearing that because the immigrants want somebody to speak their language when they're ordering a beer or something like that? Or is it because something about the France that they want, or the Christian Hungary that Viktor Orban wants? Is it more like, is that going to be something that takes irredeemably this idea of a Christian Hungary or of a white Christian Britain away from them forever? Also, then tended to get extended to ideas like HIV and AIDS, raising some of the interesting questions when we argue about a disease in a distant place. Are we raising attention about it, or are we simply reallocating resources toward existing power holders and some other matters like that? So those are some of the issues that they came up. And to me, one of the first things that we think of in media is that we don't do a lot that isn't mediated anymore. Maybe outside of the New England town meetings, in American politics, there really aren't a lot of things that don't happen through media. And it could be very different today than it was when we were all watching the Daisy ad, or the famous Daisy ad that aired one time that everybody remembers seeing a lot in the Goldwater and Johnson campaign of 1964, that all these arguments are really taking place in that format. And that, to me, puts a lot of emphasis on those selection processes, those routines of news judgment that we've developed over the past century or so, that talk about how something appears in the media, and then what kind of a threat it looks like, or what kind of an issue it looks like. Those basic selection and salience questions that Bob Entman mentions in his writings. So what kind of an issue is it? Who are the good guys and bad guys? What sorts of moral evaluation does it call forth? What kinds of legitimate solutions does it suggest? And along with that, who do we legitimize as sources? Who are the people who are allowed to speak, and who are the people who we brought in with, kind of a wink and some air quotes?
And when you talk about extraordinary measures, so taking an issue, a regular social, cultural, political issue, and kind of raising it to the status of being securitized, where we need to take extraordinary measures. Are those extraordinary measures, are they like the suspension of law? What are some more examples of extraordinary measures?
Great point, because one of the ways people have talked about this is suspension of law by the law, and whether that counts. So we can look at a hurricane, for example. We could declare an emergency, but we know exactly when it's going to end, or we know that somebody's going to call an end to it. We know what resources it'll call forth. When we talk about immigration, we can say, well, we have an immigration system. You might be treated more politely or less politely at the border, but that's kind of how it works. Or we can have total and complete shutdown on Muslims entering the United States until we figure out what the hell is going on. Okay. Open-ended, no real solution in sight, that blanket nature, rather than targeting specific things, it's all Muslims. Back in the Ebola days, well, just shut down immigration from Africa. War on terrorism, Patriot Act. Those sorts of solutions where instead of, and I think when you see the discourse and even the media legitimization of the discourse, the complaints back in the Obama days, are we treating terrorism as a mere crime? Right. Oh, this is just another crime like jaywalking or something like that. The idea that if we don't take it with the appropriate seriousness, if we treat it like a problem that we already know how to handle, that's when it risks going off the rails, and we will lose that thing that we can never get back.
So would it be fair to say that this process happens to advance and continue political agendas?
It's really hard to separate it from that. I think if we picked an issue like the climate, where we might have wider agreement around this table that, yeah, we need to do something extraordinary, we might not all agree, let's ban the F-150 tomorrow or anything like that. We might have wider consent on that, but I think in most cases, it's really hard to separate from a political agenda. Mm-hmm. And that's a really vexing question, because when we go back in time, we say, well, is a war really a political agenda? It is saving Europe from Nazism. Is that a political agenda, or is that just something we do as an advanced society that seems to need to say, yeah, Nazism is a society, but it's one we got to stop. Okay. Is that actually a political agenda? Probably not in 1942, but in 1941, it very much was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So this process hinges on collectiveness as a nation, and as a people, and you talk a lot in your book about identity. In fact, you devote a whole chapter to it. And you argue that identity is the driving force behind any attempt to securitize the societal sector. So can you talk about what identities you see as salient in the media right now, and how the media goes about constructing those identities?
Well, okay, if everybody who watched the big Donald Trump announcement on Tuesday kind of holds that in the back of their mind for a while, that's a good start, because that's a particular kind of identity, I think, for folks who've read free plug for Richard Hofstadter and the paranoid style in American politics here. That sense of people who see an America being taken away from them, right? That something precious to them is being taken away. They don't have a say in it. They're not sure they can trust the people who are doing it. But it's broadly people who, I think whenever we hear about cancel culture and political correctness, that's really the fight that we're seeing now is you were taking away some precious right of mine. I will no longer get to be me. And that bigger, I sometimes think of this as the white picket fence argument. I will no longer be able to pass along this American lifestyle with my suburban house and white picket fence. Don't have one actually, but the neighbor put up a kind of a cool privacy fence the other day. So that works out. Yeah, that sort of idea that there is this collective American identity. One of the things I'm really looking for some feedback on as the book goes more widely is how much is the book too American and what other identities help to apply in this context. But here, that idea that there's a settled American dream, a settled American way of life. When we complain about immigration, we're not really complaining about the extra effort to push 1 for English and 2 for Spanish, but about that idea that English isn't the master language of the universe anymore. We're now having to make a choice on that. And that's one thing that we can no longer pass along to our children is this idea of a place where English is the master language. And you will always be privileged because of that. That's one of the sorts of identity things that's central. And I think, again, when we hear a Boris Johnson on the campaign trail, a Marine Le Pen, when she was running for office, and the whole give us France back, damn it thing, it's not necessarily a question of, okay, do we have to, learn new languages, make some accommodations to, French laicism, to accommodate, increasingly Islamic immigrants? Is it something about being French that's now gone forever? And it's, again, where I'm really looking to see, I think some of the ideas that Kai out in our audience has had about looking at how China constructs public threats as security issues is one of the ways that might get us a little bit more out of that European American bridge that a lot of securitization is focused on. That idea that when we construct that, that's also an identity threat. We're protecting you from this, and that necessarily involves a right way of being Chinese in the Xi Jinping era.
Mm-hmm. And that diversity international and within the US, I think, is important. Because when you talk about identity and inclusion, you are also kind of by default talking about exclusion and who is excluded from that vision or that identity or that shared we. So even as you've framed the book, which you're saying is mostly domestic, do you think that there are people residing in the United States that don't hold the identity that the media are trying to craft for most of these securitization narratives?
I think that one really goes right to the point of stuff here. Yeah, it's remember, it's 50% plus 1 vote for a majority. And throughout the history, we've seen this. One of the things I get back to is a letter that I think it was somebody I heard quoted the other day talking about the African-American press at the outset of U.S. entry into the Second World War, in which a lot of the concern from the white press was looking at this idea about, okay, is this going to sow disloyalty? But he had that very good question. Okay, you're asking me to sacrifice my life. What for? It ain't for anything that I necessarily belong to yet. So what's downstream for me for this? What are you asking me to give up my life for? And that's a question that really, you can say that the double V program, so some of y'all might remember this, the idea of victory, victory against the Axis now, so we can have victory at home, victory over segregation, victory over Jim Crow after the war is over, is kind of putting that promise off. But it really does get to that question of, this doesn't consider all identities. And a lot of identities have been left out for a long time. Donald Trump is not trying to appeal to me when he says that we are going to take our country back again. The question is really, can he present enough people in the legislature or in the streets to make it appear that there is assent for this kind of move?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and the U.S. has kind of this natural identification that you have talked about, the American dream. You also extensively talk about American exceptionalism in your book, and how that is essential to the securitization process. So when you're thinking about how this might play out in other areas of the world that don't have that country exceptionalism, do you think that it makes it more difficult to securitize subjects without that thing to rally around or support for?
That's vexing. That's an interesting one. There are folks, I think Barack Obama's one, who have pointed out that, look, everybody has a different kind of exceptionalism. One thing we might say is that, yeah, but our exceptionalism is better than everybody else's because it's American exceptionalism. But I think there are a lot of cases where there's a sense of national character that's just, and again, I don't speak the language, haven't seen it constructed. This is, again, it's an area where I'd really look forward to a lot of collaborative work, across borders, across oceans and things like that with security scholars in the future. I know we have one person out there who's been looking at constructions of Russian identity in the context of especially some of Russia's adventuring against its opponents overseas. I think in that case, we probably could see a lot of clues of that in Putin's venturing in Ukraine. The arguments to this is Russia, this is Russianism. This is being Russian in these Russian areas of Ukraine that we are defending, not some abstract concept, but this is that deeply personal sense that goes back to Kiev on Rus or whatever of his day. So I think it may be a matter of not having looked for it enough. And maybe that being a place where people can look in the future as they construct these. But I have a feeling that as we look harder and as we get past some of the structural things, for American exceptionalism, a lot of it probably does look different because of that. What was the old saying from the 20th century? Friendly neighbor in the north, friendly neighbor in the south, and fish on the east and west. Countries like Germany that have legislated approaches to hate speech and Holocaust denial because of their past. Or like France, where there's that legislated tradition of secularism. I could look over my shoulder, and at the end of the bridge, there's a country where hate speech is regulated. So there's lots of cases where the American approach. One of the things I love to look at about the First Amendment is the scholar who said that the First Amendment doesn't distinguish between the people who burn the American flag and the people who march behind the Nazi flag. So in countries where that doesn't apply, there's going to be some really interesting work, I think, to dig out the identity questions and to put a name on them. And then especially to track them in media outlets. What are people seeing when they do these things that framing does?
And I think as more, as your work takes off and more people set out to replicate it, that provides a wonderful test of this outside the US context. You are one of the first, if not the first person to empirically look at the relationship between media and securitization, and it's an exciting new frontier. I think we wouldn't have thought that about agenda setting. Is agenda setting a unique US phenomenon? No, we've dispelled that by testing it all over the world now. So
and it's tended to work out well. And I will point out that your own work in issues like democratization and fake news and its international reach is going to be one of the things we follow when we look at this, because it's really hard to distinguish that. How is news framed for you? How is the outside world framed for you from how do you make decisions in a democracy? How do you make decisions in an emerging democracy?
Yeah. It's interesting. So this carries like a lot of heft. Like we're talking about a lot of really intense political international issues here. For everybody in the room who might not be so hard-minded, I want to orient us to how this work might affect something else as we're heading into the holiday season here in the United States. Fred actually has this gem in his book where he talks about the war on Christmas and how now saying Merry Christmas is a social and political attack and part of his securitization framework. And so I'd like you to elaborate on that a little bit.
I left my leopard skin Santa hat at home. I'm deeply sorry for that, and I will include a picture of it on the book cover of the next edition or something like that. I think the war on Christmas is a really classic identity issue, and we can look at it and we can laugh, but it's one of those things that we laugh at because we're despite the fact that the people for whom it's happening probably take it pretty seriously. And this again is that idea that. In this case, unlike Marine Le Pen's discourse, or unlike the total and complete shutdown on Muslims, this isn't a religion-specific threat, but it's that whole idea that saying Merry Christmas is part of what we are. Putting up our decorations too early and eating too much. And frankly, I'm delighted to see them up and down my street right now. That's sort of, if you guys want to celebrate the end of the election season and call it that, perfect. But it's that whole idea that if we let this one go, it's the beginning of the end. This is the beginning of the slippery slope. If we give up Christmas, right? If we bow to the secularists or the woke people, then we're only a step away from critical race theory in the schools. Right, then we're only a step away from, oh my gosh, it's a rainbow flag in an elementary school, and who brought that on? These are those little cultural indicators where that ability to seize on one thing, that one little bit, or that even, and I think like in many framing cases, they're going to start with a kernel of absolutely nothing. Does anybody out there know anybody who's been banned from saying Merry Christmas, for example? Or has anybody heard Christian friends be banned from saying, or say that they're banned from saying Merry Christmas, and then have a Muslim friend say Merry Christmas on their way out of the building? Right? We've heard about it happening, like so many things, we've heard about it happening to other people more than we've seen it happen to us. And the people whom we're talking about, that sort of classic cliche of media effects. Well, my friend has a friend who talked about the woman she works with who said so-and-so. From that, we build this threat to things that make us uniquely us. We've seen, I don't think it was necessarily around Christmas, but we have seen, politischen Korrektheit in German discourse. I think that was from the ADF party. We've seen similar ideas that, too much of this, and then there's that step into losing the culture that we have. Mm-hmm. So yeah, slippery slope all the way. And the next thing, your little moppets will be forbidden forever. I just saw somebody say that they're banned from saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Probably not. They just can't have a gun held to their head before they do it. And it's one of those fascinating things to me about American exceptionalism, that in the middle of a war, we managed to reverse that Supreme Court decision that said, hey, perfectly okay to require kids to say the Pledge of Allegiance.
See, now everybody has a fun anecdote for your holiday party. And way to share securitization with non-political IR colleagues and associates. So Fred, now I want you to take off your Christmas hat and I want you to put on your journalism hat, because you have a wealth of experience that you bring to this book, your classroom, all of your research. And that's your experience as a journalist. And I think you have really unique insight into how journalists construct the news and how they construct frames based on your experience writing and editing and shaping that narrative. So when media framing, as you note, by Bob Edmond, famously describes the selection and salience of topics in the news. So how do journalists make these decisions about what to cover, what not to cover?
Well, that's a 3-hour class itself, isn't it? Yeah. Well, first thing I might do is push framing back to the 1950s. So back before Entman, and point to A.J. Liebling, wonderful international reporter, was in the second wave. It was on an infantry landing craft in the second wave at the Normandy invasion in 1944, and wrote a wonderful summary, one-sentence summary of framing in his coverage of the New York newspaper strike in 1960, which is that in a labor dispute, management always offers and the union always demands. Right? That was his comment on the Wall Street Journal's coverage of this particular strike. And that sticks out because that's literally how we construct frames. They make sense to us at the time. When we're looking at a dispute like that, and this a point that I think is consistently made back from the early days of gatekeeping studies. So if we look at David Manning White and the Gatekeeper, other studies like that, we're always finding out that William Randolph Hearst doesn't have to come out of his office and hit you with a stick and tell you how many adjectives to use. At Fox News, Rupert Murdoch doesn't have to come down and say, it's Hillary Clinton, turn up the adverbs. We know these things when we're hired, and that's partly because events have to make sense to journalists too. We're narrative creatures at heart, and that the Bob Entman branch of framing is really built around that idea of that selection and salience pointing to what kind of a story it tells. So if you look at that 1991 article comparing Korean Airlines Flight 7 with Iran Air Flight 655, they form very different stories. One of them's a story about this centrally controlled, malevolent military deliberately hunting down and stalking innocent civilians, including Americans. The other is this tragic example of good intentions gone awry. I'm trying to think of the quotation. Sometimes even the best effects produce grotesque results. What an American magazine wrote about that. That's an objective decision because it makes good sense to everybody involved. It's Americans, they wouldn't do something like that deliberately. It's when we see things, you remember the study last year, it's kind of an agenda setting replication where some political science people took a Fox News audience and paid them to watch CNN for a couple of weeks, see if it changed their minds. They made some of those guesses that people who study media don't make, right? So the idea that, if CNN covered a war started by a Republican president, it would look very different. So, well, actually, no. We know what CNN looks like when it covers wars started by Republican presidents because we've seen it for 30 years, right? It looks natural because that's the way American news looks at the American world. So one of the suggestions I like to get to here is that the process of objectivity, that set of rules that we follow to make stuff look like news, and we find the raw material, we apply these rules to it, and then it looks like news. Doesn't mean we take out all the adjectives. What it means is we set rules where the adjectives are mandatory or where they're optional or where they're forbidden. Probably forbidden in the story about the debate, probably mandatory whenever we talk about how nice the weather is for the soccer game, or when we say, razor thin margin in the poll here, or matters like that. So it's that application of these rules and this construction of journalistic expertise that, in agenda setting terms, populate that list of stuff that we look at, and then in framing terms, populate ways that, and again, to give everybody from Entman back to McCombs and Shaw credit, we don't tell people what to think. Short of the electrodes and the torture camp, we can't tell people what to think. But we can channel and change the menus of things that they think about and how they think about those things. And that's what framing does. And it's these really unexceptional ways of constructing news. We teach the distinctions that we make in framing and do with footnotes, conflict versus pocketbook, you and I teach in the classroom. We're teaching people that when we approach this issue, we can think about it by who's fighting with whom, or what does it do to your wallet at Thanksgiving. We can teach episodic versus thematic framing. How do we talk to a class full of beginning reporters about, is this a story you tell by unemployed man looks at last paycheck, or here are the latest federal, Bureau of Labor Statistics data about unemployment. They look like natural decisions. We can help people make them in smart and guided ways, but they're going to be fundamentally narrative decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that resonates so deeply with what I'm doing in the undergrad classroom, and it is a natural process. So what does a securitization frame look like then?
Look out, it's behind you right now. Kind of like that. One thing that when I was trying to turn this into an operational definition for a dissertation, I was thinking specifically war on terror. So one of the things I thought is, and here we are in that basic kind of binary framing idea. Does it look like it's this narrow strip of land on the Afghan-Pakistan border, or is Osama bin Laden in your sock drawer? Is it going to come out? Is the war on terror going to be here at home? So, thank you, Michael Fulhag, for commenting. The framing is coming from inside the house. And we are here for you. In that sense, so we conceptualize that as the war on terror that's as close as next door. Could the war on terror be, oh my God, they found a prayer rug at the border? Okay, those sorts of things. Or is it this specific thing with a specific enemy that we're looking at? In simply lexical terms, we could say, do we capitalize it? Do we capitalize war on terror like war in Vietnam? And your style book will tell you, Vietnam War capitalized, things like that. Or do we think of it as like war on drugs or war on Christmas, all those sorts of things? So do we speak of it as a war in our own voice, or do we wait for a source to prompt us? Do we talk about, and I was fascinated so the AP used to run a blog called Ask the Editor, where you could ask the Associated Press about style decisions. And somebody wrote in one time, well, why don't you have some guidance on the war of terror? Should we capitalize it or not? And they said, well, no need. George Bush invented it, and we don't use the term outside of direct quotes. In the preceding work, the AP had used the term outside of direct quotes 3 times. It was the week bin Laden was killed. And they'd been using it, of course, quite unexceptionally without quotations forever. And in US terms, it probably dates to Jimmy Carter, the idea of a war on terror. So it's been around forever. It's that idea of, do we take this one and say it's a social construct like the war on Christmas, or it's an actual thing like World War II. So those are some of the ways that I looked at to make it turn into a frame. I think if we looked at the border, one of the things I'm looking at now is kind of a big data discourse where I look at the connective tissue, like the subordinating conjunctions that create meaning at Fox News. So, so-and-so in the Department of Homeland Security ignores border as crisis rages. How do we connect the current event right now to this hypothetical or this presumed event that could be happening? So that's one way it might look right now. Who gets to call a crisis? Who declares a crisis? Who connects a factual event? Here's a speech on this date with, as crisis gets worse, as approval plummets in polls, as basically pick your subordinated clause there. Those are some of the ways that to me look like, and framing isn't accidental. They're choices that we make. One thing that makes it, I think, really hard to distinguish partisan news when we're talking about that from what we'd like to think of as the objective, nonpartisan kind, is the same routines tend to produce them both. And really, unless you look in the long term, unless you see that there's one pattern where the mistakes all go in one direction, it's really hard to say this is a partisan effort to promote this particular point of view.
Mm-hmm. So has it changed your approach to undergraduate journalism instruction and how you teach young journalists and young public relations students to craft messages for the media and edit the media?
Oh, we have to, yeah. And that's, by way of saying it, I'm not the only person or even the best person waving the flag on this. A lot of this change has already happened without our necessarily looking at it. In the editing dodge, believe it or not, when I started teaching this, we were the ones that stood up and yelled at you, no, words have only a single meaning and you'll never deviate from the style book. And it's hatred for invented words like chairperson. You kind of think, well, dude, how do you think we get words? We invent them. We're human beings. We make them up. We've been doing that since the French stole all our case endings in 1066. Those, I think the best thing we can do, aside from some of the natural things that are taking their course, from more people who are professional editors saying language is constructed by users. We don't tell people, we give them the style book and say, well, no, you can't capitalize black. Or my favorite one that I quote in the book, we can't say Native American because their ancestors came on a land bridge from Asia. Matters like that. We more look at, and this is again where journalism really hasn't taken the lead, but it has started to follow in saying that we're going to let people construct language more themselves. And what we can do in the classroom, I think, is a lot, and I say this reminding myself that I need to do more of it, is a little bit less, this is what the tablets handed down from Mount Sinai say, and this is what we should think about before we do it. I'm not going to tell you, you have the wrong idea. I have the right idea because I've done it longer than you, but let's think through these two ideas and look at the plus and minuses. Let's think about that broader audience. Not necessarily the poor guy in 1942 who wanted to know what his life was worth at home, but let's start to think about more people who might be effective and more perspectives. Social media has been, in ways, I think, really instructive for that. It's helped us see the voices are kind of shrill sometimes. A lot of people yell at the New York Times who say, how could you possibly do this? Rather than, that's an interesting choice. Why'd you think about this? Why don't you think about this a little differently? But then we get into, in that case, why didn't your lead say insurrection a little bit more loudly after last Tuesday's announcement? So I think a lot of what we can do in that is, again, watch what the professions are doing, watch where professions have started rushing to catch up themselves, and then maybe be more open ourselves. And again, if a butt needs kicking around here right now, it's mine as much as anybody else's. Make sure that when we have these talks in the classroom, it's a talk. That I'm not preaching from Mount Sinai. I'm talking with you about how we interpret this, and almost off topic, had a really good, now that Twitter might be expiring, I dinged a student about a decade ago for quoting a verified Twitter account, and his response basically was, what's wrong with that? And I realized in that case, the argument he made was a verified Twitter account is somebody we know saying something. Why is there a priori a difference between calling the person on the phone and reading Twitter just because you say there is? And he had a point. Do I have to insist because my first job, I had a manual typewriter and a telephone on my desk that he has to call the person rather than getting the same exact quote from a blue check account on Twitter? I'm not going to win that one. We need to be more, aware of those things as we go. There are going to be times when we're right. No, kids, you're wrong. It's not a controversy just because it looks like one on Twitter. But there are also going to be cases where we do best by reminding ourselves it's a dialogue, and that we are, good journalists don't stop learning, and good teachers don't stop learning from the people that they teach and write about either.
Very well said. And that's also why we have public relations students in our journalism classrooms, I think. You very generously bridged your discussion of media in this book with a healthy and robust discussion about risk and crisis communication. And I actually think that was one of my favorite chapters in the book because it's where I learned a lot. And you kind of make this effortless connection between media and PR and IR. And you mentioned how crisis and risk communication can be an antidote to securitization. Can you explain how that works?
Oh, well, thank you very much. First off, I can explain how I hope it works. And that would be the idea that we can counteract this. So when I'm in my classroom, when we learn the equation for calculating margin of sampling error, I always try to tell them it's BS vaccine. Once you take the BS vaccine and it takes effect after 2 weeks, nobody can lie to you about a public opinion survey again. Ideally, that's what the numbers do in risk communication. If we get the numbers right and say, okay, here is the percentage that faces you. Here is the likelihood it will affect you. Here's the likely magnitude of the effect that it'll have on you, that people will then say, oh, cool, and make self-interested decisions. And that's the whole point of that idea is, do you make a decision that does, as if we were gaining informed consent in an experiment? Does your decision benefit you and not me or my lab supervisor or anybody like that? So that's the ideal thing, is that if we give the data, if we are perceived as credible, if we offer it in a way that leaves ourselves open to criticism but answers questions legitimately. What do these data mean? How do they affect you? How do they help you make a decision about insuring your house, moving inland, taking the family in the station wagon and getting the hell up to grandma's house in the mountains if the flood is coming? That's what we'd like it to do. And then I think what happens too often is we run into the idea that it's hard to communicate risk without that societal component as well. And that idea, we were kind of actually talking about this a bit in a defense this week. There's an idea that risk is hazard and magnitude. So the probability that it'll happen plus the scale of it if it does happen. Another way to look at that from a scholar named Peter Sandman is hazard plus outrage. So what's the probability it'll happen plus your sense that you're being singled out? Your community, your part of Southwest Detroit, is being singled out for this unfair treatment. You're being asked to take a risk that people haven't taken before. There's some outrage factor that applies in addition to this nice arithmetic equation that's going to influence your decision making. So we'd like it to be, and again, what can we do in practice? We can avoid ideas. Some of the ones that come to mind from my own background in looking at risk and in remembering covering hurricanes, we're not going to go into the time we spent 2 nights under a table in the newspaper library. The cat was not happy when we got home after that. It's nice to think about those things. That we also think that in journalism, we're the ones who are in charge of the disaster myths, the ones who point to the myth of panic. One of the things we know is panic is pretty rare in disasters. The Dresden syndrome. We see one block that's ripped up, and then we say, oh my God, the entire city lies in ruins comparable to Dresden in 1945. I always think back to one of my old newspapers. Do you remember the aircraft that ditched in the Hudson River a few years ago? Mm-hmm. Okay. The question that the newspaper raised on the front page was, gosh, the flight originated in North Carolina. Does that mean that all the polite Southerners said, no, y'all go first, we're cool. I'll just sit here and knit while I get off the plane. Is that why all the lives were saved? If we look at that in terms of disaster myths, we're going to say, no, that's what people do in disasters. It's usually harder to get them off their butts than it is to get them to, calm down. But what they're going to do is try to figure out a solution. It's cute to say, yeah, we're in North Carolina, we got better manners than y'all do, and it makes people feel, narratives make people feel better about that. But fundamentally, we come back to, nah, it's something else. It's what people do in disasters. So I'd like for these things to help. I think we can do a lot by pushing away from the command post in matters like that. Critiques that came up after, and I don't want Dr. McGuire to get nervous down there in New Orleans or anything like that. Things that came up after Katrina. Are we looking in the right places for the right narratives? That's a kind of an existential threat there. Do we look to the right people to declare the right emergency measures? Do we listen to the right signals when we say it's time to take the emergency measures away? So they become good securitization questions, and they do it, I think, partly because we look at our own practice, whether we're communicating risk, whether we're in strategic communication, or whether we're doing journalism.
And the interesting thing is that just regular people aren't really good at evaluating risk situations. We know that. In fact, they're pretty notoriously bad at evaluating risk situations. So I would assume journalists are susceptible to these same issues. So when is, if ever, securitization justified? Like, do we really have issues that warrant rallying existential fear in mass publics?
That's a sticky one, isn't it? Is this always something that the bad guys do? Or if we turn it around, will we say that's exactly what we need to do today?
Exactly.
Do we need a response? One of the fun things about getting into the files, and everybody go and check out your newspapers.com account now. One of the fun things about the files is we can look about how decisions like this have been made in the past. Was the country justified, and to what degree? And this is where it to me becomes a really important political question in 2022. How well did we handle this uncertain, unknown, foreign pandemic in 2020? We did a lot of things. How many of them were justified? When we look back, should there be the much kicked around, much derided in right-wing media, should there be a general amnesty for people who said, got to close the schools? Everybody's got to wear a mask for a while. We all went online on 1 week extra notice. Were those extraordinary measures justified? Were they not? How should we look at them retrospectively? But yeah, it's hard not to look at that and say, crisis, extraordinary measures for the duration. War on terror is it's not an illegitimate matter of securitization. National security is what we call a thoroughly legitimate referent object. What we might think in there, when I'm following a really cool scholar named Rita Floyd here, who's the one who started likening ethics to the ethics of war, the laws of war. So the question might not be so much, are we justified in going to war, but how justly do we conduct ourselves in the course of the difference between starting an unlawful war? We could say Russia-Crimea, we could say the second US-Iraq war, and behaving justly, following the appropriate laws, respecting protected persons in the course of a war. So in that case, we can ask the question, do we securitize justly? Is the climate something that requires, okay, no more new gasoline powered car sales after 2035? Okay, no more of this in this area, close down these wind farms here. That's a good question. I think that's one that to me really gets to the issue of, where do we declare an existential threat? Can we do it with our indoor voice? And can we do it in a way that's persuasive against this really powerful counter-securitizing force? That idea that climate change is not the enemy. The people who want to take away your American way of life are the enemy. The people who want to take away your SUV are the enemy. And if we give in to them, the next thing is, rainbow flags in your schools, critical race theory, and the war on Christmas all over again. We could flash back to 1941 when the polls were a little bit different. On the one hand, we have a Franklin Roosevelt arguing Germany's actually an existential threat. If it takes over England, the world that we want to live in no longer exists. Then we have this very powerful right-wing media looking back and saying, actually, the threat is you want to reunite us with England again, don't you? You want to be world president with Churchill as your prime minister, and we will lose the America that we want if that happens. it's not always going to be a question where the good side is the one that's desecuritizing and the bad side is the one that's securitizing. These things take some work. And, in the climate case, I think they take a lot of persuasion that clearly hasn't happened yet. But that's going to be a really tricky one. I like Floyd's work on that because she opens up that path of, comparison to the laws of war. And that's a good way of leading into that. How do we teach ethics? How do we do ethics? Which stakeholders do we think about? Even when we're talking about the media ethics of the Kobe Bryant crash, for example, which is, I'm really happy that nobody's brought up Johnny Depp so far in the ethics class this year. That's small pleasures we take in teaching here and there, but that's a really sticky one. What's a good securitization, and then what do we do after it's over? How do we do a good? Dr. Floyd calls that use post bello, just after war. What's a good way of climbing down? How do we requite all the people we might have had to do damage to during a justified securitization?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and reacquaint people to kind of the normal rules of order.
Yeah,
and what's expected. Interesting.
Poor San Francisco 100 years ago, when they caught like the city health commissioner taking his mask off at a boxing match during the other flu pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, how does the counter securitization occur? First of all, what is counter securitization, and then how can it occur?
I'd like to think that's one of my actual original contributions in here, and I was really mostly struck by that listening to Rush Limbaugh talk about hurricanes. That's broadly the idea. When we desecuritize, we're removing Muslims from that realm of existential threat. And these are people who go to church on a different day and basically otherwise want to hang around and do American stuff. Immigrants aren't dangerous people. They might speak a different language, but yeah, they're here for the same things that you were here for. So we take away that existential nature. We demonstrate that there's no change in threat. We feed the numbers to people. We desecuritize. Counter securitizing, we hit back. It's basically, you're not the problem. That's the problem. I'm not doing something wrong. You're doing something wrong. In the climate sense, there's that whole idea that we as Americans, I think The Economist called it American automobile exceptionism. God gave us not just fish on the east and west, but this unlimited right to 3 SUVs in every driveway. If we give that up, we've lost something important about our right to conduct a lifestyle the way that we want to. And the idea there that when the good example that John Kingdon gives, why do we do corporate average fuel economy rather than just, the heck with it, $2 a tax at the pump right now, tomorrow, to discourage gasoline consumption? One, Americans don't like taxes, and two, where Americans will figure out a good answer to it. In this case, in counter securitization, we add in that idea that, and you're trying to destroy my way of life. Okay. In counter securitizing COVID, we're looking at you're not really looking at the data. You're the ones who are creating, supporting the gain of function research at the Wuhan bat laboratory, aren't you? I'm sorry if this sounds unfamiliar, but if y'all haven't spent enough time at Fox News in the past couple of years, it's your own fault. But that's that whole idea that Michael's getting questions building up.
Yeah,
there,
I'm going to hand it off. Michael, go ahead and ask your question. I feel like I've been monopolizing Fred's discussion.
Well, I've been enjoying the heck out of it, so I share the blame on that. But Michael, would you want to start?
Oh my gosh, this is so fun.
And I know we've got our friends at the Humanities Center watching other hands going up too. So you will be tended to.
Yeah. Well, so my question is securitization a strangelove device, meaning that it can't be stopped until it's played out, or can it be successfully countered in midstream? Can it be desecuritized in midstream?
Oh boy. Now that's let me try to think over some examples of where they might have been stopped. My inclination, so I'm going to kind of say yes, but I'm going to say that it can't necessarily be stopped, but it might stop of its own before it goes off. So whether the securitization of, and we could argue over really what we're securitizing in the war on terror. Are we securitizing Islam? Are we securitizing the American way of life, or what? To me, a lot of the discourse in that points to, and again, you see this maybe more in commentary, but you see it reflected in news, is the idea that because Islam is fundamentally irrational. We can't take normal measures here. I quote a couple of columns by Charles Krauthammer, I think, in the book that point to that idea. And then at the same time, somebody will say, but they only want to protect themselves. And that, yeah, that's kind of the basis of being rational, dude. So that's, in that sense, the war on terror didn't entirely go off, but what happened to it? Where did it go? I heard a little bit, a flash of it yesterday from Donald Trump, and that's wow, I haven't heard that in a long time. In that case, we could say that a kind of entropy took over. So maybe one of the things about security is that if it doesn't get regular reinflation, it might stop short of the brink. So we put up with a war of terror that went on. Well, can we even really say where it ended? Right? It's really hard to say this is a point. We heard, Donald Trump pointed out that there was, no terrorism on his watch. A point he accomplishes by overlooking, American troops who were killed by terrorists in Syria in 2017, for example. But basically, because it doesn't form this larger existential threat of a war on terrorism, it doesn't make the top of the Fox News homepage. And in that sense, we can say that sometimes security issues die out of their own accord. They're not regularly reinflated. They kind of fall back out of the existential category into their more normal, without that regular attention. They're not perpetual motion machines. They can be desecuritized. Some of Obama's language, not that it was all successful, but like anything else in framing, we don't expect an immediate effect from one message, but the overall and often, maybe not often enough, repeated message that there's not a military answer to the war on terror. When we talk about terrorism, we don't have to talk about it as if it's separate from crime. We can say, what are the crime fighting tools that use it? So the more desecuritizing language that comes in, there isn't a military way to win this. There are political solutions to this. There are rational solutions, because the other side, more books we could refer to you are John Pape and The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, before we look at the rational actor theory in terrorism. All of those things point to the idea that desecuritizing language can contribute to this entropy and can slow things down. So not a magic switch, but then again, we would never want to think of framing as a magic bullet or a light switch anyway. But so that kind of cumulative idea.
So as long as you don't have a dedicated, sustained, multi-stream effort at charging and recharging the securitization, you've got conditions where it can be successfully countered.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think another point Elizabeth was suggesting is, if we wanted to look at the climate, that might be a classic case. There are continuing efforts. How widely they're heard and how effectively they're countered are things that might contribute to why it hasn't really taken root. But again, with these kind of questions, like anything else in framing, we're not going to single out that one effect that does it, but we're going to try to look at those cumulative patterns and where they're landing to try to make some good educated guesses. That's just still sound like I'm in last night's theory seminar. That's probably why. We're trying to make some educated guesses about what might have worked and in whom it might have worked among a bunch of possible effects. We get a little closer every time, but we're always going to, if we don't have our eyes on the error term, we're being careless.
So I'm wondering now, if we look at securitization as a propaganda problem and we're looking at countering it, I wonder who comes to mind as a political actor who has been really successful at neutralizing it.
Obama, I think. I'm trying to think of who was his Homeland Security Secretary. Were discursively, I think, reasonably successful.
Was that Jed Johnson?
No, I think it was somebody before that. I'm getting crossed up here. I'm going to have to flip through a lot of stuff and look it up that might take my focus off.
Yeah.
If we can look at a set of actions, in a lot of ways, the initial response to the missile that landed in Poland the other day, is a good response of people not securitizing immediately or taking a standard let's say let's let the process work its way through rather than push the panic button immediately, took hold pretty effectively. And that's, to a degree, involves some strategic management. I would have a hard time thinking Biden was as misinformed as his critics like to think he is when he played that down. But yeah, in general, that would be a case where it looks like somebody tried to push the panic button, or some actors probably would have preferred to push the panic button, and it didn't get pushed. So that's maybe if I can't help you with which actors, I can say which kinds of actions might help.
Right. Okay, cool.
Okay, I'm going to break in here because I see we've got 2 hands waiting from other people who want to ask questions. So
That
Michael,
sounds
we'll come
great.
back to you in a minute. Stein, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, what you just said, Fred, is actually the perfect segue for the question I have.
Great.
So you just talked about that explosion in Poland. And so while that was handled remarkably interestingly well, it of course also serves to prevent Article 5 being called on, which neither the US nor European countries outside Ukraine want. But I've been surprised that within Europe, of course, the discourse around Ukraine has been securitized because it is an existential threat. In the US, not so. I barely see anything outside the New York Times. People don't talk about it really unless they have Ukrainian roots or know colleagues or friends. So do these then artificially securitized issues suck out the air out of spaces where we actually need to look? And so Ukraine just comes to mind, and how that is handled very differently within US discourse versus European discourse. And so I don't know if you can talk a little bit more about that. You know, taking the attention away from issues where we need to actually pay attention. Climate change is another one.
No, I think you used a really apt metaphor to securitize that, which is that there's a limited air supply. That's kind of a basic way of illustrating the agenda setting hypothesis. There's only so much to go around for these things. And if you're not seeing a lot of Ukraine discourse in US media, you might not be seeing it in the places where it does take on some of those questions, or in those weird little parts of Twitter or Fox News talk shows where the mere idea of helping Ukraine is the existential threat. Right? Where that is something that risks taking away that essential part of American identity and getting us embroiled in this war. And that is, again, we're not seeing a great deal of it as an agenda item. Like a lot of international wars, it really falls off in salience for American audiences. It joins a long parade, I'm afraid, of African wars and of Asian wars, where we just sort of look and say, big deal. It's a brief somewhere inside the newspaper, and we're probably not going to hear about it. That puts a little more onus on us, I think, and maybe us in the classroom as much as us in the newsroom might be, to remind people to look widely, and that because they're not seeing in their Twitter accounts that there's a lot of talk about this, or they're not reading it in their media, to be aware of making events salient to an audience that might not recognize it yet. And I think when we do that, when we are careful, to get back to your air supply, that we put our own mask on first before we put the masks on our children, that when we're careful with that, and with helping, our students, by way of being future professionals, understand their role in directing attention to these issues, and in directing them to the aspects that these issues take on. That Ukraine is a nearish, peerish modern war in Europe, all out war between two neighboring powers in Europe, that has implications for the US and also has some implications it doesn't have. So the more we can do about redirecting that air supply to issues like this, not forgetting that wars in Africa have influence on climate policy, for if nothing else, and on how we instantiate or how we shy away from climate policy, how attention to those things might take us away from other intermediary measures toward matters like the climate. The more we can do on that, in reminding people to put their own oxygen mask on first, to look widely. One of the ideas I circle around to in the ethics part is that idea of a global ethics, where we look at our ethics stakeholders as beyond our parochial audience, beyond our local audience, and to that genuinely global audience that people like Herman Wasserman and Steve Ward talk about. Does that help? Does that get to it a bit? I appreciate the metaphor and the questions.
I think Pradeep is up next.
Hey, good to see you, Pradeep.
Hey, yeah, so great discussion. So thanks, and love this format actually. So this is so nice as opposed to just PowerPoint and lecture. So this is excellent. Thanks. Well, I have a couple of kind of rambling rambling observations, and maybe there's some question or comment in there. One was maybe media landscape. So your assumption is it's a national kind of media, in a sense that all the different maybe TV stations and radio stations and newspapers are part of the same national culture, broadly speaking, or at least their ownership is nationally based. So if you look at from other countries, especially in the South, the global South, so people are exposed to both their national media, but probably as much, if not more, to international media. So they may be watching CNN as much as what may be, on their local radio station or TV station. So that's one observation.
Yeah.
The other is kind of the distinction between what we call, say, mainstream media, even in a national culture, mainstream media and non-mainstream media. So let's say there's the mainstream media, which is vilified both from right and left, and from all different political shades, and then our local, non-commercial local, WORT or something that's providing me the real news and that appeals to my minoritized sense or marginalized non-mainstream sense. And so I wonder, in these sort of mixed media landscapes, how securitization plays out. And maybe one last observation in my rambling is that often the minoritized media or the local media or the national media and international media landscape use the news reports in the mainstream or say the international media as the facts. See how this mainstream media is doing something, and that's the fact, or how CNN is talking about what's happening. Oh, pollution in New Delhi. See, CNN talked about this. So they won't refer to, hey, the pollution in New Delhi is, just horrendous, but they'll point to the international media, how they're constructing something and why, in this case, it should not be securitized or, so I don't know. Some observations, hopefully they make some coherent sense.
I think anytime we're talking about the media landscape, it's a good time for everybody to go ahead and just take your cell phone out and set it down and think through, because you get to some of the really essential points. How do we, in a system that has, historically at least, prioritized local ownership and local decision making, yet has always built in these national perceptives and chain ideas? One of the suggestions of a point I've been referring to a lot lately from the first of the McCombs and Shaw agenda setting articles is the idea that at that first level of agenda setting of issue salience, we find even in, and that was a very tight media environment. That was Chapel Hill, North Carolina in 1968, with some sharply divergent ownership. The stunningly racist Democrat, former Navy Secretary Josephus Daniels was one of the guy who outlawed liquor in the U.S. Navy, was one of the media owners there. A reactionary family in Durham, so on like that. They could converge despite these drastic political differences on a set of issues that were broadly things, whether they talked about Vietnam from the perspective of get out now or drop the bomb, they were still able to converge on these issues. That's been one, a general convergence in news routines that is to some degree transnational, that there are practices and ideas that the convergence on conflict, for example, and issues like the agenda setting process or like the distinction in generic framing between policy coverage and strategy coverage in a political campaign. Do we talk about who has a new poll that supports them? Do we talk about who has released a new advertisement? Or do we talk about which policy toward the climate, toward mitigating pollution in New Delhi, for example, addresses a thing? And these, this adherence toward, Bob Entman talks about them as kind of systematic biases in news. The bias toward conflict, for example, the bias toward power holders, other matters like that, tend to, in many cases, I think, erase that difference that we might see between here's a national media system owned by, run by a company, stockholders nationwide. Here's one owned by Rupert Murdoch and run by his family. So a lot of those differences might wash out because journalists for both groups even if they were hired by very different people for understanding very different basic things, are still going to converge on this looks like a story because it's a conflict. This is a campaign story because it's about polling, it's about campaign ads rather than about the substance of policy. So that's one way, and that's always a different, we're not sure what people are watching. We're not sure how much attention they're paying to what they watch. Are they multitasking when they watch the local news but not the national news? Those make the guesswork more complicated. They throw more confounds into what we look at. The historic lack of attention in the US and among US media to stuff outside the US borders is another example. But when you mention the idea that CNN has reported it, now we can report it, that's not the so-called CNN effect is probably exaggerated. That CNN can create attention to a famine out of nowhere is exaggerated, but the idea that people attend to what others are doing, that there's a certain facticity that's created by something's having been reported. That's almost a speech act in a way that when something is said, there's a fact that it's been said, even if it's complete and utter nonsense about space aliens from the planet Mixiespatelic invading your vote tabulating machines. The fact of it's being said carries a certain weight. If our business is facts, that's the fact that can't be contradicted. It's been said. And at that point, we're really arguing about the details. So in a lot of ways, those distinctions never go away. Some of the variance in them is going to be taken up by these news routines. The idea of being drawn to conflict, the idea that power holders' views. Anecdote I used when I was teaching the history class. Have you been to Royal Oak? Okay. Do you remember where the City Hall is? Or do you know where the Comedy Castle is? Okay. The Comedy Castle used to be the loading dock, or that part around the side of it used to be the loading dock of the town newspaper. My wife grew up in Royal Oak. Her folks got the Detroit paper for the big news and the local paper because their daughter would be on the front page when she made the honor roll. My parents did the same thing in Greenville, North Carolina. We've always had that kind of mix of things. And one way you can look at that, once you know that geography a little bit, it's going to make perfect sense that news looks like it should look in the police department and in City Hall because they're across the street from the newspaper. So in that sense, that's just like building a sawmill on the bank of a river. You get the raw material in, you've got power turning the sawmill, you got a way to move out the finished product. Of course, news looks the way city officials and police think it does. That's your raw material. It's right across the street. Yeah, it never quite kind of answers your question. It underscores, I think, the importance of observations like the ones you made, and the tentativeness with which we always have to approach this question of media effects when we're saying who was security created for and what did it and when.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure, appreciate the question. It's a good point. It's always going to be a good point.
I think Katie is waiting to ask a question.
I want to say welcome to Katie because I think she probably gets our distance travel prize.
We can't hear you, Katie.
Katie, we can't hear you.
Okay, well, if you're still looking, should we ask Katie to keep her hand up and take some more questions? So I would really.
Would you like to type your question into the chat?
That'll work.
And I have a question for Fred. I've been waiting. It actually builds perfectly on, I think, on Pradeep's question, which is that, we were talking about the media, but I think you've referred to Rush Limbaugh and therefore the radio. We talked about newspapers. We talked about Fox News and television. So my question, and this is really coming from my English perspective, is to what extent does the genre of the media in question, or medium in question, I guess I should say, influence the way securitization happens? Does it at all?
We have a couple of theories that address that. That's a good one. Some of our theories are going to point out that if for example, we're talking about, okay, I showed it a little bit of Clint Eastwood last night in the theory class. Fine, I admit it. If we're talking about the difference between a campaign ad, a Clint Eastwood movie, and a Saturday morning cartoon, jump cut versus dissolve are going to have the same effect. that's independent from the content that they're applied to. That's saying that there's medium features that are sometimes genre features that always apply to what media do to people. Another approach that we look at in that is called cultivation. And that doesn't say your brain can't tell the difference between the 6 o'clock news, the ads, the comedy after that, and, NCIS, your terrorist next door, because your brain can. It's just that they're all contributing to to your sense of what makes a normal world and what doesn't. You get Rush Limbaugh on the way home in the afternoon, and it was one of his substitutes, I think, where I first heard about Obama's plot to assassinate Justice Scalia. If you didn't hear about that one, well, you're kind of lucky. But yeah, that's a part of a diet that doesn't necessarily, again, tell you information, but helps you put the information that you have into context. So you might have learned, when I'm driving in, I've got the radio on because I want to hear the traffic. So I'm going to learn probably really briefly about the economy because somebody talks about the Dow Jones. They'll probably use raw numbers for both that and the S&P 500, which is really dumb because they're not comparable scales. And then I'm probably going to hear an ad that says, we'll be in a desperate recession soon, buy gold and freeze-dried food right now. Those don't necessarily tell me what to do, but they all contribute in ways to how I interpret economic information. And then when I listen to Limbaugh on the drive home, I'm doing the same thing. Framing to me is as much about the context in which you hear data and in which you interpret data as the raw numbers themselves. And when you have this steady stream that think of this as a recession, think of this as a plot against Limbaugh, and you have to admit, Limbaugh is a very talented broadcaster. So is Charles Coughlin. That's one of the fun things about working in Detroit is I could ride my bike to the post office where Coughlin's paper was impounded by the government for being too seditious. Yeah, he's he's a very talented entertainer. When he makes fun of a hurricane, it's actually funny. Oh my God, it's bigger than Haiti. What are we going to do now? You don't learn a lot from that, but you learn how to think about hurricanes from that. And much as we could flash back, Coughlin's a convenient example because, people weren't necessarily learning information, but when they tuned him in, when they subscribed to Gerald Winrod's Defender, when they waited for something to show up every week, what we call the vermin press. A lot of it actually shut down legally some of it during a sedition trial, some of it like Coughlin by a combination of advertisers in the church. That doesn't tend to show up on the agenda setting radar, but it does figure into that big mix of what people are thinking about. And it helps them, it's ways of helping them make up their minds, think of what to discount and what to count more, whom to listen to the next time.
Thank you for that. I want to circle back to Katie and see if she wanted to put her question in the chat or if maybe her audio is working now. Just make sure she gets her chance.
Yeah, I would hope so. Because I know she's been up to some good securitization work as well.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's quite lengthy, hence why I didn't put it in the chat. Hi, everyone.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, you too. And thank you again for your help with my master's dissertation. I finally did it.
Everybody give it up for Katie. She defended the distinction. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm interested in the fable and the visual framing of security and how they work together. So the visual image of the enemy. So I'm doing a lot of work on, as you know, Russia and how these illustrations and cartoons, they still represent Russia as the enemy going back from the Cold War. So, and also, the ideological square, the us and them. So if you could just talk a little bit maybe about the interplay between the visual and the visual security frame.
Oh yeah, that's a really good question in both securitization and framing, and I think that's why we keep on hearing calls. I think the work that you're doing is going to help to contribute to this, to bring the visual back into framing, to not overlook that, and to think about what it's doing as, again, kind of both as information and context when we're learning the things that lean us towards security decisions. So the one that sticks out from one of the experiments we did here a couple of years ago was a story about Iran. And we illustrate this with a picture of, I think it was between a picture of Khamenei and a picture of a mushroom cloud. Those are associated with differences in how people perceive the threat of Iran. And there's a reason for that, because what that's kind of doing is It's sort of the eyes one, brain zero effect. Your eyes can tell you your brain is what's going on quicker than your brain can figure it out. And if your eyes have already told your brain it's a mushroom cloud, you're going to have to read a lot before that's not the first thing, in priming theory terms, that's not the first thing you're going to use. You're going to think of priming is like a mental filing drawer. You open the filing drawer, priming is about the first file that comes out to compare a situation to. And if we primed you with mushroom cloud, that's going to help. It's going to make your evaluations about Iran easier as you go ahead. I think in the things you're looking at, the cartoons are not, they're not literal representations, but they don't have to be. They don't have to say, Putin is a non-democratically elected leader. This is an unlawful war. This, violates Geneva Conventions A, B, and C, and so on like that. It's really, I think, in that case, enough to make that association, to make that first thing in the filing drawer be Putin's another Lenin. The illustrations that hark back to 1917, or 1942, another Stalin. Once that connection is the one that informs how you interpret, the context in which you interpret the new information, the framing has really done its work. And again, it helps your brain before your brain even knows it needs help in that case. Visuals are really powerful. Color versus monochrome, contrast and shape and things like that all tend to get the eye's attention. And when these autonomic processes, better to say, go on, we can think of them in a lot of things. To go back to the questions about jump cut versus dissolve, they don't have to be in the news or in an ad to have the kinds of effects they have. They get your attention. They help direct your attention to places. And in cases like that, whether it's a cartoon, whether it's a choice in advertising, one of my fun framing sidelights is explaining the war through beer commercials, or explaining World War II through beer advertisements, which is hilarious when you think, hey, if you buy a quart of beer rather than three 12-ounce bottles, you're saving money and we can make more tanks. But again, the thing about that is you don't have to reason through, okay, how many tanks am I going to build because I saved 2 bottle caps here, to know that beer, war effort, good. So in that sense, the visuals are that heuristic shortcut that tell you what kind of story you're reading before you read it. And if that's the decision between political actor and mushroom cloud, it's really done a lot of work. Does that help get to the point? Does it sound like any of the things you're looking at in your own work?
Yeah, so instead of just looking at language, I'm looking at images, but particularly, political cartoons, illustrations, this whole Russian bear to represent Russia, going back to the Cold War, they still see Russia as this existential threat that needs to be contained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a hard one to get over. Again, that's so convenient. Everybody recognizes it, even for folks out there. And I'm seeing this more and more among my own students right now, among people for whom the Cold War is something their parents don't even talk about anymore. That sort of memory, that quick hit that the visual gives you, I think, is still a really powerful cue, and it's going to remain that way. And when we look at, I don't think it would take long for us to look at the discourse around climate change to find cases where we might find visual cues. When I look at Fox News, or I wouldn't even say Fox here, I'd see some of the lower on the food chain conservative sites where the first thing that comes up is a wind farm. There was actually a war on birds for a while, for those of you who might have forgotten the war on birds. But yeah, the first image that comes up in your mind, is it a wind farm in your backyard? Is it your personal view being obstructed? Can I personalize you freezing because we don't mine coal anymore? When we can personalize those quickly through an image, again, it's doing that heavy lifting for us by telling us what kind of a story it is.
Yeah, because I'd say just finally, my big part of my research is the Cold War legacy and how that Cold War legacy is being implemented in the media frames. Like you said, the memory, the Soviet bear, communism, how that is represented in the frame. This whole us and them, us versus Russia.
Mm-hmm. It's not just us versus Russia, it's us versus Russia in a fight to the death.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like we're gonna trade a few punches and go home. It's the same thing as when we all had it's the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again. It's not just interstate dispute between two countries. It's this whole thing that we thought was solved. So sure, when in any kind of powerful connection like that, that's one reason that I think people like Buzan and Weaver have talked about the war on terror as a master or a macro securitization. Like a master frame, it organizes all the other talk around it. So talk about U.S. intervention in Central America in the 80s is organized by that whole Cold War frame rather than, democratizing countries in the global South doing so and so. It's all still us versus Russia.
Mhm.
And that's, it's our us versus Russia is probably different from yours or from Central Europe's, but it's still it's still the bear.
Yeah, like Russia and the West.
Yeah, still coming after us.
Thanks, Fred.
Glad to have you. Well, so I see that the time is moving ahead on us, and I see some folks have had to go. I welcome our linguistics friends, and we didn't get to spend much time there. Do we have time for a couple more questions? And do we have folks who have some more stuff to talk about?
I think so. It's 4:28, so I think we have time for maybe one quick question.
I could wrap us up if nobody else has a question. I wanted to draw on Margaret and Jeff's point that they talk about war on terror hasn't had an ending, just go to the airport. And in what instances do we, like the aftermath of this, you said that there's no real end point. So when does it just become the new normal? Can extraordinary provisions become the new normal in some cases? And is that how we lead to ultimate democratic decay, to a concentration of power?
Interesting. Hard to answer the biggest term question in that, which is the concentration of power and the decay from, do you still, because I haven't been to the airport for 3 years now. I don't know if you still take your shoes off. And I don't think that by itself signals the end of democracy, but it is a very extraordinary practice that, again, if we flash back to the days where everybody smoked on airplanes and you could take your pocket knife, those routines have already been changed. The empty your pockets, don't bring your knife. I left my Swiss Army knife in a suitcase one time and no longer have it because it's over at Metro Airport now. Things like that have gotten a routine and just worked into the normal way of life of things. Masks are still very sharply contested, but in a lot of ways that's been worked into, a lot of precautions coming back from that have been worked into normal life. We could look back again a century, and the coverage of the flu pandemic is kind of interesting in that regard, because there were phases where San Francisco, for example, thought, oh my God, we lightened up too soon. Mask mandate comes back in, at 6 o'clock this afternoon, so everybody had time to run over to the Salvation Army or someplace and get a new mask. So we do tend to kind of re-securitize those things. And that we can look at as a case where, okay, the extraordinary measures eventually passed out. Fluoridation never really stopped being contested, but that's not that extraordinary a measure, except in the minds of some of the real fringe folks out there. Vaccination, widely accepted, but it's still very sharply contested on the right wing. It's still linked with these broad anti-American conspiracies. There are a lot of cases where practices becoming normalized is probably a good thing. And that may be a case where we can look at that as an outcome of a good, if more people being attentive to vaccine updates, even if the flu is an outcome of COVID, we're probably going to say that in the long run was a good securitization, or was a more just securitization that has been decelerated justly as well. War on terror, I'd rather not be taking off my shoes going on the airplane. Was that an exaggeration? I don't know if that's a big enough hindrance for somebody to raise it in Congress. So when do we repeal the Patriot Act? Maybe more so, and again, maybe more in line with your research, have we created expectations about privacy, about digital privacy, that we should be paying attention to? That'd be one that worries me going ahead. And that'd be one where if somebody hasn't turned up the attention, that might be something we want to take up with our elected officials and say, who's going to be the person that says we no longer need this? if we ever did in the first place.
Well, thank you for sharing so much with us today and having
Thank
such
you
a
for
great discussion. It was wonderful to get to read your book, to be one of the first people. I'm going to promote it and say, everybody go get Fred's book. Fantastic.
Well,
And
thank
it's
you for
filled with Fredisms. So it's just a pleasure to read.
thank you for a really close read, for some really sharp and theory-headed questions. And for all the other, for those who don't know, the folks who chimed in, I'm reminded again of how lucky I am to work and teach with a bunch of really smart people. Kind of like in music, always surround yourself by people who play better than you do, and your life will be good. I will always love the Humanities Center, and I am delighted to see it in great hands. And it has always been wonderful, helpful, and thank you for putting this kind of event on. And let us know, you're on the permanent Friends of Communication list. Anytime you'd like to come over and hang around, let us know. Yeah, so thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, John. Yeah, thanks to Ariel. Thanks to Jamie. And everybody. Thanks. I'm having a good time with it. Thanks to everybody who showed up and had questions. And if we didn't get to you, I'm sorry. Drop a note, come by and complain. And thank you, Ariel, for the confetti cannon. Okay.
Thanks, everybody, for being here on behalf of the center. And thanks again to John for putting all of this together and being a wonderful coordinator. Congratulations, Fred. We were delighted to celebrate.
John, Jamie, Ariel, thanks for spending a snowy Friday in front of the screen. You really made the Zoom thing work. It was great.
Wonderful. Well,
our pleasure. Thank you.
We'll wrap it up here. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Take it easy, everybody. I look forward to seeing you all around campus or someplace else cool. Bye-bye.